And I think the priority challenge is going to be the new post-2015 agreement and the question of the elements of the negotiating text, because that's mandated from the COP, that we need to agree on the elements so that we can have draft negotiating text by May 2015. So the identification of the elements and the elaboration of the elements are going to be probably the main political outcome where there's going to be focus for Lima. In addition, there's also going to be quite a lot of debate on Workstream 2 of ADP, which deals with short-term action on increasing mitigation ambition. There are a number of technical expert meetings taking place during the year on Workstream 2, and these are expected by the proponents to result in some kind of action or some kind of commitments to increase mitigation action pre-2020. So these are going to be the political top lines, but alongside this, there's also going to be negotiations on things like adaptation, mitigation issues related to the KP, market mechanisms, capacity building, and a range of other topics. There are about 4 or 5 issues on adaptation that are on the agenda. The first one deals with the question of national adaptation plans, which is something that was agreed upon in the Cancun Adaptation Framework, but parties are still struggling with 2 aspects of it. One is the question of the actual content of the plans, and therefore the guidelines for preparing the plans. The last meeting in Warsaw recognized that there was a need to revise the guidelines, so there's going to be more debate on what are the guidelines and what are these plans. Are they a list of projects or are they something else? And that's going to be a major debate between the developed and the developing countries. So that's going to be one. The second aspect of the national adaptation plans is the financing and the means of implementation for them. At present, there's only guaranteed financing, unguaranteed or at least stipulated financing for plans from the LDCs, and in Warsaw, the COP called on other entities to provide support. So I think the GEF, for example, is now beginning to develop modalities to support, provide financing and technology and capacity building and so on. So that's going to be one issue, the national adaptation plans. What should it contain? How should we implement it? What support is there? Secondly, there's going to be the revision of the Nairobi Work Program, which is a program looking at the scientific side of adaptation. The challenges there right now relate to, one, the dissemination of the results of that program. It's done quite a bit of good work, but the work is not disseminated. People do not know and therefore cannot use the outcomes, and therefore they're looking at modalities to increase the effectiveness of the dissemination. And then they're also going to be looking at the scope of work of the Nairobi Work Program. There's a proposal to include it, to expand it to include work on indigenous peoples, which I guess you'll be very interested in. The role of gender, which I guess you'll be very interested in also. Fragile ecosystems and those kinds of things. So there's going to be this debate also on what does the Nairobi Work Program actually do, what does it focus on. And that's important because it is supposed to be the bridge that facilitates implementation by generating understanding of the issues which the implementers can then use to actually do practical actions on the ground. Thirdly, there's going to be a question of looking at issues relating to the LDCs, least developed countries, which is going to focus really on the implementation of the NAPAs, that's the National Adaptation Programs of Action. About 50 countries now have NAPAs being implemented, and the question of the effectiveness of the implementation, the support they receive and so on will be reviewed. There's also going to be a review of the Adaptation Committee, and the challenge there is that the Adaptation Committee last year had some difficulties with funding. They didn't receive sufficient funding to carry out the 3-year work program, and therefore we'll be looking this year to see if that has been rectified, if donors have provided the money, and therefore they can become more effective in what they're doing. Then on the financing side, there's also going to be the question of the funding of the Adaptation Fund, because that fund depends on the price of CERs, Certified Emission Reduction Credits, in the CDM market. And because of the low demand for CDRs, because of the low ambition of the mitigation commitments, the price has become close to zero. And that meant that the adaptation fund had very little money at the end of last year. During COP last year, one of the developed countries pledged $100 million towards the adaptation fund. And therefore that should have helped them come through this year. But the question is what's going to be the funding going forward for the adaptation fund, because that's really one of the main sources of financing for concrete adaptation implementation on the ground. So there are a number of issues on adaptation which, while they might not command the political highlights, are all important for us as developing countries to be able to plan, program, implement our responses to climate change. Then when you turn to the ADP, adaptation is also going to be a key issue, because the ADP is looking at how do we incorporate adaptation into the new agreement. Should it be incorporated at all? And you have some of the developed countries saying there is no need to integrate it into the new agreement because it already has its own framework under the Cancun Adaptation Framework. On the other hand, the developing countries are saying, look, we need to include it. We need to anchor the institutions. Some are even saying we need to have an adaptation goal, which has been proposed but is still being elaborated. Some are saying we need to have an adaptation reference framework with metrics for M&E, which again is still being implemented. So there are a number of issues that are being proposed, will have to be fleshed out during the year, and we'll have to decide, do we put them in the new agreement as parts of the legal text? Do we put them as decisions that support the legal text, or do we ignore them at all? All these issues still have to be resolved. Loss and damage is a very important part of the Lima agenda for two reasons. One is that in Warsaw, the task of setting up the institutional arrangements was not finished. Essentially, the COP set up an executive committee, but did not decide on the composition, who should be in the executive committee, and did not decide on the procedures, or what actually should the executive committee be doing and how should it be doing it. So those two issues have to be resolved. And again, developed and developing countries are miles apart on those two issues. Developed countries prefer to work with existing agencies who are already within the convention process, and agencies outside the convention process doing related work. The developing countries would prefer to see something a little more independent, which will draw on these existing agencies, but don't necessarily be led by these existing agencies because their mandates don't permit them to work in those areas. So that question will have to be resolved. Question of the procedures and the focus of the work will have to be resolved. Should it be promoting enhanced understanding as its main focus? Or should it also begin to initiate work immediately on providing action and support on the ground? Things like helping developing countries to strengthen their early warning systems, their risk reduction procedures, and beginning to look, for example, at how can we help countries which do not have risk transfer mechanisms, insurance, say microinsurance, and those kinds of things, to be able to move in that direction so that if and when extreme events come along or you suffer losses, there are mechanisms to provide some kind of redress for the losses that have been incurred. So that first set of work is going to be important to finish the setup of the loss and damage institutional framework. Then secondly, while this is happening, the COP last year also decided that we should have an interim work plan. So they set up an interim executive committee and mandated them to initiate work on a work plan to be approved in Lima on loss and damage for the next 2 years. That work plan, the interim executive committee met last month to discuss the work plan. They had hoped to finish it in one meeting, and they did not finish it because there were differences in perspective among the different members. So we expect that to go forward for another meeting before Lima, but then it will have to be approved in Lima. And we could probably expect some debates as to what should be the focus and content of the work plan. So yes, loss and damage is going to be an important agenda item on its own, and it's also going to be important in terms of whether or not it's included in the elements of the ADP. So that's a separate thing. It's going to be part of the ADP process also. So it is going to be an important issue.